Welcome to the first Roy Morgan webinar for 2023. Shortly I'll run through the new rankings in trust and distrusted brands in Australia, and I'll introduce social scientist Dr Ross Honeywill to give us his insights. But first we have breaking news on Qantas and new insights on the damage done to Optus and Medibank by their customer data breaches. Just to remind you, trust is the foundation of all human connections. It gives business leaders a license to navigate in uncertain times and to take swift, decisive action when disaster strikes, whether that's economic, social, or health disasters. Trust is the underpinning foundation of brand reputation. This seems a simple enough aphorism, but it's much more than a useful slogan. As the foundation of brand reputation, trust has a positive material impact on a brand. It goes way beyond comms and onto the balance sheet. Take the global consumer goods brand Unilever. More than 3/4 of Unilever's market capitalisation is created by trust and brand reputation. That's 100 billion euros. But it's distrust, where our deepest fears, pain and betrayal surface. Roy Morgan data on distrust and our own lived experience since 2018 reveals that distrust can destroy a brand's reputation and create the opposite effect to that enjoyed by Unilever. Medibank, for instance, lost $1.6 billion off its market value immediately following its much publicised data breach. So how do we measure trust and distrust? Well, we're Roy Morgan, so obviously we conduct a survey, a continuous survey. And we've just entered our 6th year of asking 1,800 Australians each and every month which brands they trust and which brands they distrust. We also ask them why they trust or distrust those brands. And we record exactly what they say, verbatim, in their own words. This research is open-ended and completely unprompted. So that means for people who nominate a brand, it's so top of mind that they put it ahead of all of the other brands that are swirling around in their consciousness. Now to the breaking news on Qantas. In the last quarter of 2022, Australia's national carrier Qantas plunged 31 rankings from being the 9th most trusted brand in Australia to becoming the 40th most trusted. In all our years of measuring trust and distrust, we've never before seen such a dramatic fall from grace without there being a singular crisis, like, for example, the Optus customer data breach. And when we see such a sudden drop in a brand's net trust score, that's the black line with the dots, it's usually due to a dramatic increase in distrust. That's the red columns. You'll see this happening when we take a closer look at Optus. Trust, on the other hand, that's the green columns, tends to move much more slowly, less dramatically. So what's really interesting about Qantas is that the plunge in its net trust score is being driven by a dramatic hit to both its trust and its distrust at the same time. This is unusual. It's very unusual. Shortly, Ross will look at who in particular is driving this change in fortune for the national carrier. But for now, let's look at what's behind this demolition of Qantas's reputation. From the middle of last year, Qantas was hit with a torrent of public criticism over cancelled flights, lost luggage, appalling call centre delays, snail's pace fare refunds, and a leadership that was seemingly out of touch with the horrors being faced every day by thousands of once loyal passengers. In June, for example, Qantas reportedly had the highest flight cancellation rate of any Australian airline and the lowest rate of on-time arrivals and departures. To add insult to injury, they pushed airfares to unimaginable levels, some fares more than doubling on popular long-haul routes like Melbourne to Los Angeles. And by the 4th quarter of 2022, Australians had just had enough. This graph shows the 3 main reasons the main reasons people gave for Qantas's dramatic rise in distrust. The top cause, unsurprisingly, is a mix of Qantas not being customer focused, bad service and call centre problems. The second reason is a simple statement: a poor employer. And the third is a kind of mix of airline being unaffordable, ripping off customers with high fares and price hikes. Pretty much sums it up, doesn't it? And these new levels of distrust ran so deep, they pulled trust down with them, and that's really rare. So what did people actually say? Well, almost universally, respondents' comments are passionate, angry, and really deeply felt. Just look at the language. I hate how they operate. Given the erosion of safety standards, it's only a matter of time until there'll be a fatal Qantas accident. They gave local jobs to overseas contractors. That's hard to forget. Terrible customer service. They lie. So what we see here is a groundswell of deep hostility towards Qantas. But what about reactions more specifically directed at the CEO? This graph shows another reason why Australians distrust Qantas, and it's all about the CEO, Alan Joyce. Let's have a look at what Australians said. Once again, they're passionate and angry. Australians say, when things go wrong, the CEO blames customers. They say Alan Joyce continues to line his own pockets, and Alan Joyce is a disgraceful boss who's treated his staff disgustingly. He has destroyed Qantas. Always cancelling flights at the last minute is always someone else's fault, according to Alan Joyce. Now, this is a small but representative sample of how deeply Australians feel about Mr. Joyce. I often say that distrust is the shock of discovering we were foolish to trust too much. And when I think about Qantas and analyse Australians' reaction to Alan Joyce's half-hearted apologies, one quote comes to mind. It was a mistake, you said, but the cruel thing was it felt like the mistake was mine for trusting you. A final word on this extraordinary turnaround for Qantas. Its historical safety record, built up over more than a century, has afforded it legendary status. But Australians have now clearly had enough, and Qantas's historical reservoir of goodwill has now breached its banks, emptying almost overnight. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because it makes Qantas a fragile brand, a brand that's susceptible to a disruptor or competitor, opportunistically stealing its disillusioned, newly distrusting and disaffected customers. This is Virgin Australia's potential moment in the sun. Whether or not they're up to it, only time will tell. We'll all stay tuned. Now let's look at two other Australian brands that are suffering the devastating impacts of distrust. Very public customer data breaches like those suffered by Optus and Medibank provide stark evidence of how damaging distrust really is. Since the data breaches, Optus has reportedly lost up to 1 million customers, and as I mentioned earlier, Medibank's market value crashed by 1.6 billion in just a single week. Longer term, both brands have a mountain to climb to return distrust to manageable levels. Every day someone asks me, how is Optus faring? So let's find out. On the 22nd of September, Optus suffered a cyber attack that raided the personal data of 11 million customers. This was a bad breach. The hackers accessed names, dates of birth, email addresses, driver's licenses, Medicare details and passport numbers in some instances. But when we look purely at trust scores, you would never know anything happened. There wasn't even a blip. If, like everyone else, we at Roy Morgan only measured trust, we'd be able to tell Optus not to worry, that they got through the data hack with no impact on their levels of trust. Then why are we losing hundreds of thousands of customers, they would justifiably ask. And the answer is, of course, customers are leaving because they now deeply distrust the Optus brand. Optus's plummeting distrust quickly made it Australia's most distrusted telecommunications company, with more Australians saying they distrust Optus than Telstra, and that's a first. And when we look at the net trust scores, that's the black dotted line, we see that Optus has fallen off a cliff. By December, Optus's net distrust score was 5 times worse than before the data hack, and it immediately fell 15 places in the rankings to become the second most distrusted brand in Australia. We'll look at that in context shortly, but for now, let's take a look at what's driving so much distrust in Optus. Well, you don't have to be a genius or even a Roy Morgan data scientist to know that the top reason for distrusting Optus is that it doesn't protect or respect privacy. This is where Optus has the most work to do. Trust and Net Promoter Score aren't the problem for Optus. Its problem is distrust. And remember, distrust is what makes a brand fragile. All those customers leaving Optus are going somewhere else, to another telco. So the most trusted telco in Australia, Aussie Broadband, will likely be a grateful beneficiary. So what about Medibank? Is Medibank faring any better? At 11 a.m. on Thursday, the 13th of October, exactly 3 weeks after the Optus cyber attack, Medibank, and I quote, detected unusual activity on its network. 2 weeks later, it conceded that hackers had accessed all members' personal data, including names and addresses, phone numbers, dates of birth, Medicare details and health claims, including medical diagnoses and procedures. That must have had a devastating impact on trust in Medibank, mustn't it? Well, no. Trust in Medibank is usually pretty low, much lower than, for example, trust in Optus. But what we witnessed after the data hack was a bizarre, if small, increase in trust for Medibank at precisely the same time it was losing $1.6 billion in market cap. This is a kind of pattern. We saw it for Optus, and we're now seeing it for Medibank. What we're seeing is that trust, like a Net Promoter Score or customer satisfaction, is calculated on a scale of positive sentiment, whereas zero trust is just a lack of trust. It's not toxic distrust, which is measured on a totally different scale, a scale of negative sentiment. In short, it's important to be trusted, but it's devastating to be distrusted, as the next slide shows. Within 2 months of the data breach, Medibank's distrust had plummeted. You can see that on the right, but not to the same lows as Optus. The net result is that Medibank's net trust score reached all new lows for the brand. That said, in the same time frame, Optus's net trust score was 5 times worse than Medibank's. Now, I hasten to add that the results are terrible for both brands. But while Medibank became the 14th most distrusted brand in Australia, Optus became Australia's second most distrusted brand. I think that's enough of negative news, at least for a few slides. So let's now take a look at the data for the December quarter. First, a quick look at the industry rankings. The supermarket sector is still by far the strongest in the economy. Coles and Woolworths keep pulling the sector up. Consumer products overtook retail in the number 2 spot, and social media remains the most distrusted. But Optus's net distrust score is pulling the telecommunications sector ever closer to social media. Automotive and transportation both improved, while the travel and tourism sector deteriorated and is getting dangerously close to distrust territory, largely thanks to the decline of Qantas. Now let's take a look at specific brands. First, we look at the good news brands, those with a net trust score, meaning they're more trusted than distrusted. And looking at the top 20 most trusted brands, there's no change in the top 5, with Woolworths again taking the top spot as the most trusted brand in Australia. Interestingly, the gap widened between Australia's most trusted bank, Bendigo Bank, and ING. There are now 4 places between them. I say this is unusual because normally they're neck and neck. RACQ rejoins the top 20 brands for the first time since early 2020. The biggest improvers are IGA, jumping 3 places, David Jones, Target, Samsung and RACQ. Interestingly, half of the improvers are retailers. Those that lost ground are of course led by Qantas. Less dramatic losers are ING, down 2 places, NRMA and Apple, both down 1 spot. Now it's back to negative territory, Australia's most distrusted brands. Those brands more distrusted than trusted. Facebook and its owner Meta are again the most distrusted brands. In our last update, Optus was on the top 20 most distrusted list in 17th place. This quarter, it deteriorated by 15 to take number 2 spot. Medibank, in our last update, was in net trust territory. So it had further than Optus to fall, and fall it did. 72 places to take up the 14th most distrusted spot. Along with Optus and Medibank, losers in the December quarter were Twitter and BP, with AGL deteriorating by 2 rankings. Twitter's deterioration can be summed up in 2 words, according to our respondents: Elon Musk. The biggest improver on the most distrusted list is Westpac, moving from 10th to 18th. Other notable improvers include Crown and McDonald's. ANZ also improved following CBA and NAB's exit from the top 20 distrusted brand list. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr Ross Honeywill to share his insights on the Qantas, Optus and Medibank crises.
Thanks, Michelle. Now, as many of you know, NEOs represent the greatest dollar value and are future shapers. They're really life's economic rationalists, but have a very, very keen sense of what gives a brand social license. And they judge brands really harshly. In Australia, we've got 5 million Australians with the NEO mindset, driving the fast lane of the 2-speed consumer economy. And there are 10 million Australians with a traditional mindset. Now they're taking the slow lane perilously close to recession. The legendary business commentator Robert Gottliebsen recently wrote in The Australian that NEOs were responsible for unstoppable spending despite everything around them heading towards a recession. While the 10 million traditional consumers are price sensitive, despite millions of them being affluent, NEOs are motivated by a desire that goes way beyond the necessities of life. NEOs spend more, they spend more frequently than anyone else on the planet. So after that brief introduction, let's see how it plays out for Qantas, Optus and Medibank. Australians with the NEO mindset have always been Qantas's core customers. For example, NEOs were 62% more likely than traditional Australians to be Qantas frequent flyer members. But just look at this graph. After the start of COVID, traditionals didn't really miss a beat. They're the red line. Their trust and distrust remained largely unchanged. That is, until the last quarter when it dipped. But the net trust scores of NEOs, alive to what was happening at Qantas during COVID, plunged to record lows, virtually wiping out the huge economic advantage Qantas had enjoyed from high spending, frequently travelling NEOs. Optus is a different story for NEOs. They were always distrustful of the brand. Once again, NEOs are the green line. So when the Optus customer data breach happened, NEOs reacted faster than traditional Australians, and their net distrust fell 2 times further than traditionals. Faster and further is a phrase that often applies to NEOs. For example, they recover from recessions faster and further than traditional consumers do. It's all to do with optimism and their healthy skepticism. Now, the NEO picture for Medibank is even more grim. For more than 2 years, NEOs have been in net trust territory for Medibank, which helped the health insurer tough it out during the financial challenges of COVID. But neos are fanatical about privacy and data protection. Just ask Apple. So when so much personal information was hacked, neo distrust plummeted. Interestingly, by the same as Optus, 2 times more than traditionals. So finally, we know from Michele that distrust is both toxic and dangerous. We now know what makes brands fragile when distrust plunges dramatically, when highly valuable neos feel foolish that they trusted too much, their distrust explodes and they go looking for brands that better align with their values and expectations. But for now, it's back to you, Michele.
Thanks, Ross. So don't miss our next brand webinar scheduled for the 25th of March, when we'll bring you updated trust and distrust brand rankings and a deep dive into the telecommunications and energy sectors. And be sure to look out for our webinar on the New South Wales state election. It looks like an uphill battle for Premier Dominic Perrottet to retain office, but we'll have all the latest data and insights for you on the 20th of March, 5 days before the election. In the meantime, why don't you subscribe to our YouTube channel for a whole range of Roy Morgan data and insights, and check out our online store for trust reports. But for now, thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you next time.